Welcome everybody to today's tutorial. I'm Annie and I'll be helping to coordinate everything today. Today's speaker is Laura Dilley from Michigan State University. So welcome. But first of all, we're going to have a few words from Antonis.
Thank you, Annie. Well, today it's a pleasure to have Laura Dilley from Michigan. I must say I have a long story with both Michigan and Laura in particular. With Michigan, I took my first certificate of English as a foreign language in my youth. So my first diploma of a foreign language was this proficiency certificate from Michigan. And then now, Michigan has a long tradition, especially in phonetics. And I remember it's now quite a lot of years that a student of mine came at Athens University and said, "Oh, here we have an excellent PhD. I'm studying it." Yes, which PhD is this? It's from the States. That was Laura's dissertation. I had a look, and what I saw, it was a fairly independent work. I mean, not influenced by a lot of current trends. And after that, I've seen one paper here, one work there, and my students were often saying Laura's name. Well, I didn't know about this today. Time passes by, and here we have Laura in person. Who could imagine it some years ago? I said some time ago, Laura represents the new generation of linguists. I mean, not by status or age. I mean, I'm over 70 now, and I could have been, though I'm not. That is what I would have dreamt. But anyhow, although prosody and phonetics has always been interdisciplinary, now more people are getting the brain involved and brain functions and things like this. And I have already some questions like, where does speech production begin? Do we have brain correlates or neural or whatever? And how is perception functioning? Well, those things, Laura will talk about language understanding, prosody segments, and the role of the predictive brain. Laura, I think we will really enjoy your talk. Please go ahead. Oh, the prosodic expression, the floor is all yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Antonis, for the lovely invitation. I'm truly honored to be here for the International Society of Experimental Linguistics Symposium. Thank you all for joining on. I was asked to present a presentation that started with a little bit of an introduction about myself, my background, my trajectory as a scientist, and then to tell you a little bit about some of the problems and contributions that I have made to experimental linguistics. So without further ado, I am just going to go ahead and share my slides that will help to animate this presentation. With any luck, you can see my slide. And I want to make sure and be able to see you. Can you see me? Hear me okay?
That's good.
Yes,
Yes, that's
can.
perfect.
Lovely, thank you. Okay. So this is the outline. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my path as a scholar and lifelong student. And it starts with the United States. I grew up here in the middle, which is considered flyover country between the East Coast and the West Coast. There are some interesting things to see, but you have to have a reason to stop in there. As I was trying to find my path, I had a journalism teacher that gave me an article one day about Noam Chomsky and Rolling Stone. And I also had a mentor who gave me David Crystal's Cambridge Encyclopedia of Language as a gesture for being the top calculus student in our district. So I loved language. I knew I wanted to go into language. And I applied to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to try to work with Noam Chomsky and join the amazing team of linguists there. And I was so fortunate to matriculate. One of the very first fortunate things that happened to me, which has forever shaped my life, was getting a job in the lab of Stephanie Shattuck-Huffnagel, psycholinguist and prosody expert, who was just a terrific, wonderful mentor. And she was part of a larger lab run by Professor Kenneth N. Stevens, the speech communication group. So this is a storied group. There have been many phoneticians who've come through the speech communication group at MIT. And as far as other influences along the way, Steven Pinker's work in language and thought influenced me as I took up cognitive science along with linguistics. Morris Halley was there. Gunnar Font would stop in from time to time. And I greatly admired the work of Dwight Bollinger, who by then had passed on. But since he had been at Harvard up the road for many years and was a prosody expert, I, as a precocious undergraduate, discovered his work and really availed myself of it and was inspired by it. And then there's Dennis Klatt, who worked in speech synthesis, and I almost did my dissertation on synthesis and speech synthesis and prosody. As I made a choice in my PhD, I was sort of not entirely enthusiastic about descriptive linguistics. I wanted to do some experimental work. I also wanted to understand the brain. I wanted to approach my study in my career of language from an interdisciplinary level that united sort of the brain level, all the way, understanding neural processes up to concepts and words. So I selected this Harvard-MIT speech hearing bioscience and technology program, which was started by Nelson Y.S. Kiang, the man here on the left, who had a vision to provide an interdisciplinary education for students. It had only been around a couple of years at the time I joined on, and students designed their own program with the help of a committee. And my focus was on experimental linguistics, phonetics, and phonology. Frank Guenther was part of the program. He was working with Joe Perkel to study speech articulation and the auditory feedback loop in our brain that enables us to articulate carefully speech sounds like R. They were looking at different articulations of R and intelligibility across the lifespan. In the end, my research focused on phonetics and phonology of intonation and tonal systems. I did a bunch of experiments testing Janet Peer-Humbert's theoretical approach from her dissertation back in, well, we'll say at 1980, and tested whether the psychological reality of pitch accent categories, some were supported, some results suggested a need for revision to the categories. And in the end, I proposed something that looked a little bit, or was inspired in part and took further the work of Mark Lieberman, who had begun in his trajectory working to put forward the foundational ideas of metrical stress theory. He had done some work on intonation. And so it ended up that, that I put forward that work in intonation for my dissertation. But by the time I was out of graduate school, I was really, I felt the field wasn't really ready for that work. As a graduate student, there was just a lot of still focus on the traditional descriptive categories, but this problem that I had discovered along the way of tones, tunes, meanings, and words, how we are able to derive meaning from this incredible array of sounds that we produce and perceive. And if I can articulate a question that has driven my research over the number of years now since graduate school, I would put it this way: what are the principles by which humans extract or are able to learn to extract meanings from complex spectral shapes or patterns uttered with particular pitches and rhythms? How is it that we trade in this complex sound information and somehow it maps to these conventionalized meanings? I started to pick up interest I had developed and started to take this forward as a research problem in my postdoc. Two things being, one, the word segmentation problem, the issue of how listeners are able to take the speech stream and chop it up into words to figure out where those word boundaries are. And the role of rhythm and prosody in that, as well as speech recognition, how we're able to understand words, especially when they are produced in a casual, not very clear way. And here's a whole number of people that influenced me along the way. Dennis Klatt's work was kind of a starting point because he was very focused on prosody and the word segmentation problem. And Cutler's work was marvelous and inspired me from the time I was an undergraduate. She was very focused in psycholinguistics on the word segmentation problem, on word recognition, and the role of prosody, rhythm, pitch. Bob Ladd started to be a mentor to me when I really got into his book, Intonational Phonology, reached out, met him at conferences, and his work on tones, tunes, and meanings was really formative. Keith Johnson, the well-known phonetician and great guy who took over for John Ohala at UC Berkeley in phonetics, was working with Mark Pitt, who ended up being a postdoc mentor to me, Mark Pitt being a speech perception researcher in cognitive psychology. Mari Jones was at Ohio State as well, where I did my postdoc. Everybody hear me okay? All good? Terrific. Mari Jones, emeritus professor of Ohio State University in music perception psychology, had done work on how pitch and timing and rhythm lend predictive cues that shape perception of subsequent events. So I was very interested in that work. I was able to sit in on some of her lab meetings. And then Robert Ramez had done foundational work over time on speech perception of degraded speech signals. So sine tones can actually sound like speech, and that, as many of you know. And he was one of the people who discovered that finding, that very puzzling finding. So I've been at Michigan State University. Early work that I will tell you about shortly led to an NSF Early Career Development or Career Award and an NSF follow-up grant on this early research, kind of at the time quite exploratory, quite new, on how prosody contributes to word segmentation and word recognition. I've also worked on some NIH grant projects related to prosody and segmental quality and infant-directed speech and child prosody. A couple of things I'm most proud of, I gave the keynote address for Speech Prosody 2016 Boston, and I was an invited speaker a couple of years back to honor Michael Tannenhouse, well-known psycholinguist who pioneered eye tracking as a methodology for real-time investigation of language perception. And he was awarded, I think it's a $100,000 prize for the Rummel Hart Prize. And I was one of 4 speakers to be invited to talk. And that relates to a collaboration that I was very fortunate as a junior researcher to have the opportunity to work with this more senior researcher, culminating in some really fabulous, in my view, papers along the way. All right, so I've told you a little about my my background. By the way, I welcome questions. I'm going to try to keep a lookout on our group here. Thank you so much for being here. What I'm going to turn to next is a discussion of some research problems, perspectives, and findings, and tell you a little bit along the way, as I was asked to, about my contributions to experimental linguistics leading up to our discussion period. But let me tell you, let me try to put in my own words some issues about language and linguistic representations that linguists for decades, if not centuries, have been challenged by. So the question that I posed earlier, which has been one that I've returned to and been fascinated by over my career, it's really driven me, is what are the principles by which humans are able to communicate through conventionalized symbols grounded in sound patterns? And we can unpack that a little bit more, complex spectral shapes with certain pitches. I mean, we have to talk about the different kinds of sounds we have. Well, how have linguists approached this? One way of trying to articulate principles of how humans can communicate through these conventionalized symbols that have some meanings that are grounded in sound, particularly, is via rules, such as what we have in classic generative phonology. And that has some strengths, it has some limitations. Linguistics has its arc of narrative and foci, and we've seen the rule era. Optimality theory is another approach where you have rank-ordered constraints that are accounting for diachronic and synchronic similarity differences processes that approach the problem or of articulating principles for how humans trade in these communicative conventionalized symbols. Then we have maybe richer representations that we start to get into sort of less simple views or less constrained, and there becomes then a need to understand the constraints and develop the predictions. Exemplar theory being one, the idea that the mind is capturing sound and sights and in the context of meaningful exchanges and internalizing this in a way that results in communicative capacity, but also a richness of perception that can be brought to bear on understanding. And I'm going to put forward another, in some ways, complementary view, which is not the easiest one to think about: dynamical systems modeling and theory. But I put this forward for your consideration as another way of thinking about, potentially as much as our human minds can grasp, the principles, a candidate way of considering the articulation of principles by which humans may communicate through conventionalized symbols. Let me say a bit about this. So what do we mean by dynamical systems, and how does this get to brains and linguistic representations? Well, we don't need to know a whole lot about this. It's a rich area of math, and our human brains, have some limitations when it comes to wrapping our heads around math. But if we want to get down to it, maybe we can think about this in some respect. So dynamical means time varying. Our brains have time varying patterns. Our speech has time varying spectral characteristics. System simply refers to emergent phenomena in the aggregate that arise from dynamical, chaotic physical processes. So dynamical systems, again, time varying systems that rest in some way on physics and chaotic processes. So here's a key, from complex time varying physical systems, stabilities can emerge. And there's a word for that. It can be called attractor basins. And I don't want to go into what that is or necessarily any particular theory of how language is implemented. But what we can say is that that language is rooted. Language is rooted in brains. Language is rooted in the complex dynamics of brains and our systemic behaviors as individuals with brains in some society. So how does this relate? How does this help us in any way to think about the problem of how humans have conventionalized language and symbolic systems? Let me get to that. So categories, in this way of thinking about things, can be understood as stabilities. Stabilities maintained over some time. Notice we have time in there. Notice we have stabilities. So we're starting to make some conceptual connections. The notion of forming categories, as we must in language, whether as a child or as an adult learning a second language, forming categories implies a process over time. And in language, we settle on a representation of the categories, but we know that the categories in language may shift. If we move to a different part of our country, where there's a different accent, our pronunciation can accommodate to that of the local people. So we know that in language, our categories are in flux, and we do define words in new ways as we gain more information. So my assertion for your consideration, which I think comes from now a lot of different convergent angles of science, some of which are directly in linguistics, the brain can be understood as a dynamical system from which stable categories are emergent and meaningful from shared communities of speaker behaviors. And there's a lot I'm glossing over, obviously. We're not getting into math, but conceptually, I'd like to argue that this is perhaps a new emerging way that could be the way of the future. I want to unpack this a little bit more because I'm laying some groundwork to help not only articulate my contributions to experimental linguistics, but to help share my thinking about what these findings that I started to put out 10, 12 years ago mean, how they can be understood within the most current science. And so to continue this line of thought that started from the question of how can we humans, how can we articulate the principles by which humans trade in symbolic representations that are meaningful and based on sound patterns. Brains, symbolic language, and dynamical systems is a nexus we should think about. And I came across this work by a guy named Howard Paty, who happens to be a physicist. And apparently he's been writing papers over the last decades about language and the brain from a physics point of view. And he's more, although he's not widely known in linguistics to my knowledge, he has made an impact, particularly on cognitive science and in that nexus of cognitive science and language. So he has this collection of classic papers I discovered on the physics of symbols, and you'll see this word in blue down here, symbols, the physics of symbols with contemporary commentary. So if you'll bear with me, I wanted to share some really pretty intriguing quotes to me because they articulate some of the candidate principles or concepts that I think help to unpack where neuroscience has come in and helped us to better understand how language may be situated in the brain and help us to understand how the basis of its symbolic nature. So Paty says in a preface to this work, my first papers present the view that the subject-object relation first arises with the emergence of records of events, by which I think he means memories, right? Memories of words, memories of concepts, records of events. Records require, for our storage of them, some form of material symbols that represent the events and an agent that interprets the symbols. Okay, so bear with me. We're talking about symbols. He's a physicist coming from physics, but also thinking about language in the brain. So he goes on to say, I also explain why evolution requires a symbolic language, that physical laws do not construct and cannot interpret. This is the basis of the new field of biosemiotics. So an interesting pointage there. My later papers extend these principles to classical models of reality that require, and here's some key words we'll come back to, hierarchical levels, with the levels being defined by complementary models. You know, again, we might talk about linguistics in terms of rules or optimality theory, and we try to get closer to the truth as science goes on. We try to get a more refined way of capturing the generalities and specificities. So there are a couple more slides of quotes here, which I think lay the groundwork well then for the rest of the talk. The co-editor, Racacek Leonardi, my attempt, says, we had at our disposal, she was referring to thinking about approaches in psycholinguistics and finding Petit's work. She says, we had at our disposal methods of traditional psycholinguistics with its information processing models, consisting of symbols, rules, parsers, and mental lexicons. And we're familiar with this type of linguistics, right? Still, we were very much aware that the use of language involves time-dependent dynamical processes. This is something that I think we as experimental linguists and interested persons can appreciate the struggle between the symbols and the time-varying dynamical, maybe speech patterns. Racacek Leonardi continues, the perspective presented by Petit has the potential to forge a third way of conceptualizing linguistic systems, alternative to the two dominant approaches in cognitive science. And what are those two approaches? Again, she's talking about, on the one hand, information processing, highly symbolic, versus time-dependent, dynamical. So she's saying an alternative to the two dominant approaches in cognitive science is based not on showing that one of the approaches is reducible to the other, but on retaining both the information processing and dynamical approaches as complementary models, right? So in fact, maybe it's the case, I will argue, that the dynamical approaches gives us, in some sense, the symbolic representations as kind of, you get it for free if you understand the dynamics well enough. That's a hypothesis. So, so that is all in service of laying, laying out the big picture for this talk, right? And this feeds into kind of a change in how I think many linguists and cognitive scientists are changing, or recognize that there has been a change over time in the way that we think about the speech chain. The classic problem of how does the speaker produce these sounds, have some concept that they turn into words that result in some muscular activity that induce time-varying waveforms in the air that are picked up by the listener's ear and translated into electrical pulses and decoded as words and ultimately concepts. That's the speech chain. And that was traditionally envisioned as essentially an exchange of bits, ones and zeros. And there, this was originally formulated in terms of distinctive feature theory. And a lot of engineers, blood, sweat, and tears have focused on trying to figure out where are the bits in the speech signal. But what we're starting to realize is that when two brains are communicating with one another in the speech chain, in fact, there is an alignment, there is an entrainment of one brain to the other brain. So the speaker may start talking and define a semantic space that can be detected as nature. And so the listener is trying to discern, what is this person saying? What are they talking about? What words are they saying? What do they mean? As soon as this finding of common ground, this conceptual alignment of brains starts to happen, the speech perception process becomes more successful. So maybe being in the environment, person starts to articulate, the speaker starts to articulate tree, and the phonemes arrive to the listener in sequence. And then this process of figuring out, what is the next word? Well, by virtue of common ground and conceptual alignment of brains, the computational issue of finding the right word is considerably simplified. And there's more than is just in the speech signal by virtue of this conceptual alignment. So one person can start to say bird, and then gradually over time, the conceptual spaces and phonological spaces reduced to find the right word, bird. So the point being, we've moved on from thinking just about bits and information transfer. That's still an important part, the symbolic part, but there's also this this alignment, this neural entrainment, if you will, finding common ground between brains and through shared representations and dynamics. So just to unpack this a tiny bit more and lead you to my direct problems of focus. What are some philosophical perspectives in linguistics that are relevant to the upcoming section? Well, let's start by asking an age-old question of what are the units of meaning? And an easy answer, an answer that most linguists would give, which I have no problem with and is correct, is words and morphemes are the units of meaning. Or, morphosyntax, how you string together morphemes in order to get some well-formed output that has meaning. Next question, what are the compositional units of words and morphemes? Well, we can say pretty, with few caveats, segments and phonemes. And we can broadly characterize that as morphophonemic content. So now the real question to me, the one that has driven my research in large part, what are the principles by which expressive aspects of language, including rhythms, pitches, or what we might call generally prosody, is this related? How is this related to morphophonemic content? And so a provisional answer that we might offer is that prosody is overlaid on the morphophonemic content. And I think that's probably a standard view, is that, you have your morphophonemic content, that's your meaning, and then you have your prosody, and prosody is just overlaid. Okay, so you can see it's because I flagged that as provisional. I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit and argue that maybe we need a more nuanced view. So my work, coming to my contribution, my work has shown that contrary to the prior foregoing articulated framing, the principles of forming and extracting meaning via sound patterns, that is trading in this conventionalized morphophonemic content with meaning, these are not well described necessarily by the notion of prosody as overlaid. Rather, I would argue, dynamic expressive prosody over time is intrinsic to the formulation and extraction of meaning itself. Dynamic expressive prosody over time is intrinsic to the formulation and extraction of meaning itself, words, morphemes, and higher level pragmatic concepts. So how might I go about showing this? Well, I would argue that going on 10 years or more now of my work has focused on demonstrations, experimental demonstrations of auditory illusions from my lab, where lexical and morphological structure changes under alterations of context prosody. And because you can show that context prosody changes the lexical and morphological structure of something that is coming up, this indicates that we need more nuance in thinking about the principles of trading in symbolic linguistic representations. We need to be able to explain these auditory illusions, and we need to have a more nuanced way of explaining the prosody segment relationship than merely one of overlay. Okay, all good? Any questions? Very good. So I'm going to continue to talk a little bit more about brains and why I think they're so cool, and why understanding the dynamics and principles of operation of brains will help us understand language as a human activity and capacity. And this is where we start to need to refer to prediction and probability. So when we are listening to a speaker, trying to figure out their syntax and semantics, or their phonology, or what sounds might be sequenced one after another, or their prosody, we make predictions. We as listeners generate predictions about the upcoming syntax, about the upcoming phonological patterns, and we generate inferences about what is likely to happen next. So prediction, as shown by now, couple decades, I would say at least, of psycholinguistic work and experimental linguistic work, prediction is central to language comprehension and production in a way that we're starting to appreciate even more and have conversations about. Again, thinking about a refinement of our understanding of principles of linguistic operations and capacities. So let me unpack this idea of brain as dynamical prediction engine. This is a really remarkable view that has started to take hold in cognitive science and become well known, that the brain seeks to predict, and I don't mean in an anthropomorphized way, I mean in what it does, how it operates, its very nature and the physics of impulse, action potentials and connectivity. The brain seeks to predict the messages, intentions, and actions of others. The brain is a prediction engine, and the brain creates dynamical representations that embody prediction by virtue of neural connectivity. So the brain, again, seeks to predict external sources, what's going on in the world, and make meaning from its predictions. And so the sense making that the brain goes through, whether it's for language or cognition or understanding someone's actions, intrinsically the sense making process involves predicting what that might look like by recapitulating past experiences, recapitulating past memories of similar actions, similar words, similar situations, and trying to come up with a representation internally that best matches those external stimuli and sources. This is a really revolutionary idea in cognitive science. I highly recommend this article by Clark, 2013, if you want a cogent view. It's more about the brain as a whole, not necessarily focused on language, but we're starting to see more and more linguists, experimental linguists, cognitive scientists who work in language take up this idea. So the brain is constructing forward predictive models, checking predictions of those candidate models that might explain the world and might give us a representation of it against the sensory information, with the goal of so-called minimizing error, that is finding the best fit between, among all its many models, it might generate the best one for this set of stimuli and sources. So this is consistent with what we can say is a perception, action, and cognition approach, which has existed in in cognitive science, but now applied to language. The idea, again, that how do you perceive something? Well, you're remembering past experiences that are similar, and including past actions, and using those memories in a predictive way to generate different models of reality, and that's cognition. This is really an intrinsically, it's kind of a mind-blowing way of thinking about things. Perception and production are then two sides of the same coin. If you're perceiving, then you're basically recalling past memories of production. And that's a successful perception of language on this view is successful recapitulation of past memories of production instances. So it's kind of mind-blowing. All right. So I've really laid out some big questions. I told you that my research relates to prosody and segments and extracting meaning from words. How are we going to get to some specifics here? So let me try to zoom through here. we're going to be using ambiguity in language to see how prosody might push around different representations. And so how is language ambiguous? A number of different ways. We can have a phrase. There's a classic example by Stamp, 1973, of all the different pronunciations of the word divinity. Divinity fudge, divinity fudge, divinity fudge, right? And we have phonetic symbols to capture those slight variations. Somehow they all map, in spite of massive reduction, to the word divinity. So there's ambiguity in the realization of words and the way that they map to something in our lexicon. Then if we have a sequence of phonemes, even if the phonemes themselves are clear, we have to make some inference about how those phonemes map to words. For example, if you have phonemes crisis, turnip, do those phonemes map to something like a girl crying and a dog biting an ankle, or to crisis and a vegetable turnip? We have to make an inference about which of the lexical level mappings would be appropriate for a string of phonemes. And I'm going to be telling you about some experiments that rest on different kinds of ambiguities and pushing around the lexical content that people might hear. For example, whether there's a function word present in a phrase like minor child or minor or child, versus maybe also ambiguities like plural versus singular, saw hens or saw hen, where in my dialect of English, the word a, that little article, can be co-articulated and blended with the prior word. So again, this is in service of an idea that there's a need for more nuance in how we think about the principles of language. And I'm arguing and presenting results in this space about prosody and morphophonemic content. So I've told you enough that I now want to make a prediction about some experiments that I did and then tell you what they mean. So the prediction is that performed or realized prosodic context. I use those words performed or realized kind of in a deliberate way, but prosodic context, so I argue, can alter perception of upcoming morphophonemic content, that is words or morphemes. How so? Via predictive expectations. So the claim is that the brain is a prediction engine and that prosody is informative in its own right, constraining meaning by virtue of the timing and pitch and other characteristics in the context. If so, this argues against independence of segmental and suprasegmental as a foundational language principle of perception and production. And I argue that it will call into question the primacy of so-called segmental cues for communicating words. It will challenge that view of primacy of segments. Well, why is that interesting? One reason that was interesting, certainly 10, 12 years ago when I started this research, was that psycholinguistic theories did not in any way predict such an effect. There should not be, an important role of prosody in determining words of, for material that's coming up in the context. That was just not even in the universe of things that people were considering. And I started putting together some ideas for an experiment near the tail end of my postdoc. I remember having a conversation, just jump out of this real quick, having a conversation with my then postdoc mentor, Mark Pitt, a speech perception guy, and I'd been working on the Buckeye corpus, and he didn't think it was going to work. He said, go ahead and try it, go ahead, see what happens. But he was very, very skeptical. So, I didn't know it would happen, but I knew that my stimuli were pretty convincing to me. So I ran some studies, and let's kind of go through what some things were. So real quick, the argument is linguistic structure trades in statistical dependencies between past linguistic, maybe recent linguistic performance and upcoming performance. That there's a statistical dependency that can be informative. Thus, prosodic context partly determines the phonetic realization of phonemes in words, providing deeply useful and important from a principal's point of view, contextual cues and constraining production. So consistent with the idea of brain as dynamical prediction engine. So we're going to test the idea that prosodic context distal to linguistic material can alter meaningful words perceived in that material. We're going to be challenging or testing the primacy of segmental representations and the assumption of that's in most of linguistics about a dichotomy or independence of segmental and supersegmental layers. We're going to use as our testing ground in experimental materials lexical ambiguities. So I'm going to tell you about one set of experiments that involve testing for the presence or absence of a word or morpheme via the influence of context timing or rate cues, and other experiments that relate to lexical level structures, testing the influence of context rhythm cues. We're going to do context rate cues first, and then context rhythm cues with some different kinds of ambiguities. Okay, so I'm going to zoom along here. Word segmentation is a challenging problem. It relates to how listeners know where words begin and end, or how many words there are, what was said. Phonotactics might help. Words are comprised of syllables, which have an obligatory vowel nucleus with flanking consonants, and subject to a language's phonotactics and lexicon. We might be able to parse a sequence of vowels and consonants into some kind of candidate syllables, maybe make some inference about the words. Acoustics might help with the word segmentation problem too. Most consonants involve changes in spectral energy, amount or distribution or a voice source changes that can lend discontinuities. It might be a hook into where there's a break between words. But what if there's no consonant at the syllable boundary for a word, such as a little vowel initial word like a or? So a lot of my research is focused on casual speech and little words, how we recover them. They're so important for our meaning we extract. So there might be a glottal stop or an energy dip at the beginnings of one of these words, but maybe there's no such acoustic evidence. Maybe there's a prior open syllable with some co-articulation. And so how do we perform word segmentation for short, meaningful material? For short words like a or, could there be a critical role for context prosodic timing? Let's just look at this little word a. Here's the little word a. I put a line there. But if you look, there's nothing at the onset of the a. Unless I draw this red line, you can't see. I would argue there's no definitive clear evidence that there's a start to a word here. By contrast, you can see lots of discontinuities that might be means of breaking up the signal elsewhere. And the phrase is something like, and move to a different, to a. Okay, so this might be an instance where the timing information in context is informative and constraining at a principled level for whether there's a word there. And this is just a corpus study that shows that there are a lot of cases in running speech, in fact, in casual speech, where these little words don't have any discontinuity. So notice that this is kind of like a identification of different category levels of discontinuity. Yellow means no discontinuity, and we see a lot of yellow meaning a lot of instances where vowel initial function words don't have a discontinuity. These are bars with 100% and total function words, and then 5 different individual function words. So lots of cases where there's no acoustic discontinuity to tell a listener where that word is. So the hypothesis was that the prosodic structure of context would be strongly informative about later words. And this was an experiment that I did right at the tail end of my postdoc, and it turned into a neat paper with Mark as a co-author. He was amazed. And so the idea is we took sentences that had in this first experiment been produced with a little word like the word or, minor or child. This could either be a coordinated phrase, or it could, if the word or is not there, it might be an adjective noun sequence. So in one condition, the entire sentence was presented at its normal spoken rate. And the expectation was that the rate cues would be informative about the word presence. This is what it sounded like.
Anyone must be a minor or child.
Hopefully you could hear that. And then in the most important complementary condition, the chunk of audio that contained the word was held constant at its normal rate, but the context was slowed down. And the prediction was that people would entrain to this slower rate and essentially fail to hear the word because they had adjusted for the slower rate, and the word length was not long enough to be heard as a separate item. So we predicted that people would not report the word. It would be missing from their reports of the sentence if they did a transcription task.
Anyone must be a minor or child.
That was an especially slowed utterance, but it doesn't even have to be that slow in order to get the effect. So the effect was that a spoken word contained an acoustic material that was held constant across rate conditions, that little chunk, minor or child. When that chunk was in a slowed context, the word disappeared. So here we have a chart showing in a transcription task, the percentage of reports that contained a function word in a normal rate condition, which was at where the entire sentence was at the normal rate, or where the chunk that contained the word was embedded in a slowed context. And we can see that very large decrease in the rate of hearing the word. So people go from hearing the word most of the time to not hearing the word most of the time in the normal versus slowed context. So that was cool. And then a complementary experiment showed that for matched phrases that were spoken in an elicitation task without the word, so minor child, for example, a matched phrase spoken without the word was hallucinated to contain the word when that chunk, that matched chunk, was embedded in a speeded context. So in this transcription task that listeners did on these spoken sentences that we knew did not have the word, when the sentence was presented at its normal rate, there were hardly any function word reports. But when that chunk, that like minor child, was embedded in a speeded context, there were 7 times more reports of function words. So this was a big finding because it showed that contrary to psycholinguistic theories, which prioritize the segmental material, now suddenly, for some strange reason, prosody in the context is having a massive effect on the words people hear. So I'm going to kind of zoom through this. We've done a number of experiments over time now, including with sentence context. So this follow-up experiment focused on English plurality, which was a neat test bed to elaborate on this effect, where you can have sentences like, the Petersons are looking to buy a brown hen. Notice the buy a brown hen soon for their farm, as compared to, and there's no S marker there, no need for an S because we're using a singular construction in English. But the contrast would be, the Petersons are looking to buy brown hens soon. So we have this interesting case where there are 2 loci of potentially informative information about where timing might be important for whether you hear a word or not, whether you hear something as singular or plural. So this was an eye tracking study, and just to kind of tell you the gist of it, in eye tracking studies of language, there is a goal of trying to understand the cognitive processes of word perception when we're looking at word recognition. And so the particular displays had alternatives that involved 1 or more than one of an item. So 1 or more than 1 hens, 1 or more than 1 raccoons, and some distractors. And because it was a careful study, there were 2 conditions in which the phrases were produced either as baseline plural, buy brown hens soon, or baseline singular, buy a brown hen soon. So that was just a control. And the important variation, or independent variable, related to variation in rate. And so in one condition, let's just look at the case of buy a brown, spoken as a singular. this was the chunk containing baya ba. And in this so-called spoken rate condition, the entire sentence was presented at the normal spoken rate. In a so-called distal manipulation condition, the rate of context was slowed down. So the chunk baya ba is the same rate, but everything else around it is slowed down. And basically what happened is that this changed the probability of hearing words as singular or plural. It changed the meaning when the time course of the sentence around a chunk of audio that was exactly the same chunk, baya ba, that was perceived as referring alternately or with different probabilities, according to people's looks and at its display, as one hen or multiple hens. And so that's the gist of this display. It was a really significant effect. And this pattern of a change in perception based on the context rate also showed up in results involving picture selection data. So this would be like the case where the phrase was spoken as a singular hen. And so we have a few looks to the wrong picture, hens, when things are at the normal rate. But when you change the rate, people are looking at essentially the picture that wasn't spoken a lot. And that's the gist of this figure. So the take home is that altering the rate of the context in which some words are occurring changes the meanings that people hear. And that kind of a dependency between prosody and the extracted meaning, the words that are perceived, is not expected. And I'm happy to talk more about these results at the end if anybody wants to ask about them. But just to say before I wrap up this part of the experimental results, there also is cross-linguistic generalization. So this effect of changing context rate, altering for some fixed acoustic material that's coming up, the perceived words, that also happens in Russian and Mandarin, we know from other experiments. So it's not just an English specific effect, but extends to prosodic processes of extracting meaningful content, understanding the relationship between timing produced at one locus of an utterance and another locus extends to some pretty diverse languages. All right, so I have succeeded in showing you evidence in support of one prediction that relates to a certain kind of ambiguity in the presence of absence or word or morpheme. Let me just briefly tell you a little bit about lexical level structures and how they can also be affected. So I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly. Some of you may have been to another talk or heard results along these lines, but in the same vein of whether prosody and context can influence the words that one hears, we don't necessarily have to focus on ambiguities in whether a word is present or absent. We might focus on ambiguities in whether the way in which you arrange syllables into words could be affected by prosody and context. And so pitch accents are a more complex type of prosodic element that are important for focus, for expressive rendition. And what we can notice is sort of surprising. This is an example I loved from Bob Ladd's work, showing this repetition that happens sometimes in pitch. I wanted to read it to Julia, or I wanted to read it to Julia. This is something that happens. Pierre Humbert noticed as well and remarked in some of her work that this was this sequential dependency. It seems to show up. It was not something that was captured by intonational phonology. Didn't have a good explanation. But if we look, I'm going to go right ahead. If we look across different elements of phonetics and maybe even auditory perception, we see that there's a tendency for hearing regularities in auditory stimuli, for gravitating to repetition in perception, enjoying that in parts in music. And when repetition occurs, there tends to be a structure that is imposed by listeners that implies some kind of dependency in time about if you hear one structure, you're going to continue to hear that structure over and over again. So repeating patterns in pitch and time lead to inferences on the parts of listeners, presumably due to some deep principles about rhythmic structures. And so if there is repetition in pitch, like a high-low pitch that might occur in pitch accents, that's going to be subject to constraints or some sorts of structural constraints on the representations that are inferred. And elements in time tend to be over-regularized. They tend to be heard as alternating in stress. So in this experiment, I used speech materials that involved sequences of syllables with a lexical ambiguity at the end. So for example, a phrase like worthy vinyl lifelong handshake, 8-syllable sequence, the end can be organized into words in more than one way. And to kind of speed through, the gist is that the final part of the utterance is always going to be acoustically constant within a condition, and the prosody is going to be changed in one of 3 ways in 3 different conditions. In this one experiment, which involved F0 changes or pitch variation only, imposed through resynthesis on the first part of utterances, there was a monosyllabic condition and a disyllabic condition, and the expectation was that the monosyllabic context condition with its specific F0 manipulation would result in kind of a predictive carry forward of the perceived structure, influencing the words that were heard in the last part, and resulting in this case, a monosyllabic word being heard.
Worthy vinyl lifelong handshake.
Okay, versus a disyllabic context that was predicted to result in hearing, for the same acoustic vinyl material, a disyllabic word.
Worthy vinyl lifelong handshake.
And I'll just play the stimuli for the 2 other conditions quickly to give you the flavor of how the manipulations induced potentially different perceptions of the upcoming word content based on the prior prosody. Here was the monosyllabic condition in a case where duration was only manipulated and pitch was held constant.
Worthy vinyl lifelong handshake.
Versus
Worthy vinyl lifelong handshake.
Okay, and then finally, a condition that combined both the pitch manipulations and the temporal manipulations to produce a monosyllabic context and a disyllabic context that were expected to be even further apart in the rate of hearing a 1-syllable word or a 2-syllable word.
Worthy vinyl lifelong handshake. Worthy vinyl lifelong handshake.
Okay, and these were the results. The y-axis is the percentage of time that in a free transcription task, people wrote a 2-syllable word. And the left 2 pair bars relates to the rate of hearing a 2-syllable word when only duration was manipulated, that is pitch is flat and only timing in context is changed. But you can see that when the timing corresponded to one pattern in context versus the other pattern, people went from hearing 2-syllable words quite a lot, at least 50%, to substantially less. So the context prosody is changing perception of upcoming words, making it more or less likely that people will organize syllables in according to one word structure or another word structure. And that effect was even stronger when the manipulations were based on pitch or combinations of pitch and duration. So that was the basic finding. And then we went on to replicate and extend that finding that people use context prosody to make predictive expectations about upcoming word structures in ways that influence in the moment what words they think they're hearing. So this was an eye tracking study involving ambiguities like pan, the cooking implement versus panda, the animal. And so depending on the prosodic context, whether it was predicting grouping of Panda, pan and the upcoming syllable together or apart with other surrounding material, that was predicted to alter in the moment the extraction of meaning. And that's exactly what we found. You can see the eye gaze trajectories, probabilistic eye tracking averaged over many trials. You're seeing significantly different probabilities of inferring in the moment that people are hearing pan or panda as a function of the prior context, the prior prosodic context. And so that is even true for if you've ever wondered about whether sounds like IPA the schwa symbol, or the stressed in IPA are, what makes those different? They're really not that different in perception, because if we did a similar experiment where essentially using ambiguities like jury, which has the stressed sound, versus giraffe, which has schwar. In IPA, those are categorically different sounds, but this experiment using a similar type of manipulation of context prosody showed that in fact, a word like jury can momentarily be heard as giraffe and inferred to mean something completely different as a function of the prior prosody. So the prior prosody can essentially overrule the local stress characteristics. If a word was spoken as jury, people are willing to accept in the moment that stressed as an unstressed schwar, and vice versa. If a word spoken as giraffe is in a context where the prior prosody leads to an expectation that jur is a strong syllable, people are willing to accept and will hear in the moment that juror sound from giraffe as referring to jury. So that's the gist here. So I've now shown you evidence of the second type of lexical ambiguity. And so as predicted, I'm coming to the end here, contrary to traditional psycholinguistic framing, the principles of forming and extracting meaning via sound patterns were not well described by the notion of prosody as overlaid. This was shown by these auditory illusions, such that when context prosody was altered, listeners heard different words, even though the same critical acoustic material was presented in different contexts. It's always the same chunk of audio, but changing the context prosody changed the perceived meaning, the perceived words embedded. So when we look over time at how dynamic expressive prosody is used by speakers and listeners, we find that this dynamic expressive prosody is intrinsic to the formulation and extraction of meaning itself in terms of words, morphemes, and higher level syntax and pragmatic content. So in this last few minutes, I'll just present a more nuanced view of how we might understand this than traditional concepts. So from complex time-varying physical neural systems, I argued that stabilities emerge. And this can be thought of as neural entrainment, modes that our brains get into when we understand particular concepts, and these are shared concepts among people. You realized also, or understood as attractor basins in physics, forming symbolic categories, including linguistic ones, is, I would argue, and I think follows from a lot of work, well described as quasi-stable shared neural dynamics that have intrinsic, where the neural dynamics themselves have intrinsic hierarchies and periodicities that may, I think, have potential to help elucidate where language hierarchy comes from. And dynamical systems formulations of remembering and recapitulating categories, categorical representations based on our shared behaviors and experiences. I would argue, and I have argued, that these kinds of formulations provide the most accurate descriptions of language systems and processes. So this leads to a view that the brain is dynamically computing the best interdependent models in terms of trying to understand communication, trying to understand other people, what they're about, 3 different types. The argument is that the brain is dynamically trying to compute a model of what is the message, that is, what are the language structures being spoken, who's delivering the message, is it a man, a woman, a child, what's their ethnic background, and then what is the intention? Why are they delivering the message this way? What are the pragmatic circumstances that led to this particular production? Is it deception? Is it truthfulness? Apology, etc. And so in the final couple slides here, I would like to highlight some recent work came out just this year, culmination of really about almost a decade of collaborative work with Meredith Brown and Michael Tannenhouse. We've come up with a novel conceptual theoretical framework for how words are recognized and segmented. And it rests on the idea that language systems succeed in recovering units by computing optimal decisions under uncertainty about the hierarchically organized units that are present, and also who's talking and why. We focus on extracting the hierarchical units present. Particularly, we are proposing that linguistic plus real world knowledge give rise to predictions about the linguistic units that could have made up signals, including syllables, phonemes, and words, where the candidate alternative models might have very different hierarchical structures, and hence different word compositions, different syntax, but the brain picks the best one based on the best fitting characteristics. And so this is similar to, recalls Paty's statement about models of reality that require hierarchical levels, with the levels being defined by complementary models, and that's consistent with our syllabic inference account. So in summary, some concluding thoughts. An age-old linguistic problem relates to the principles by which humans communicate through conventionalized symbols grounded in sound patterns. And I argued that the most accurate descriptions of language systems and processes are provided by dynamical systems formulations of remembering and recapitulating categories. This is based on now a lot of work that shows that brains demonstrate dynamic stabilities involving neural activation patterns that develop over time in both a sort of long-term and very short-term sense, but over time, which are evinced across individuals, maybe the speaker and the listener, or groups of communities. All people watching a movie will get entrained to that movie because of the shared experiences, the shared understanding of the representations and the categories. And so the argument is that this is a productive, fruitful way for us as experimental linguists as a field to explore our understanding of how language works. And so my work is focused on the interplay and dependence of prosodic and segmental structures for extracting word-level meanings. And I showed that when context prosody is manipulated, that acoustically identical auditory material can be heard as containing different words. And this has led to, I think, spurred some paradigm shifts in psycholinguistics that maybe had already started to come to the fore with challenges to the notion of phonemes as primary and so forth, pushing the envelope a little bit. And I would argue that all of what I've presented today is consistent with the view of the brain as prediction engine, as well as the emerging consensus of perception, action, and cognition as a basis for human perception and behavior, including for language. And the final argument is that modeling what is being said, who is talking, and why they're acting the way they are, what they say the words the ways that they are, is what is going on in the brain to make a best fit estimate of the representations. And I showed the syllable inference model as one step in that direction, proposing different hierarchical representations of words, syllables, and phonemes. And with that, I would like to extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to Professor Antonis Botinis and the International Society of Experimental Linguistics for hosting this talk and for so kindly inviting me to be present, as well as my many collaborators that without whom I could not have done this work, and the funding agencies that have supported it. So thank you so very much, and I would be very happy to field questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. I'm sure there'll be some questions and comments. So if you have a question or a comment, please click on the reactions button on your screen where you have the option to raise your hand so that you can ask your question. Okay, Elena, would you like to go first?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm here together with my colleague. We're working on high-level speech segmentation, and we were wondering if you had done any work on something higher than just phoneme or word, and do you have any insights about that?
What I can say is that the ambiguities in these materials in many cases rest on alternatives that have different syntax, different pragmatic inferences that are possible. So I don't think I have a specific example to share, but what are you doing that, what ways are you investigating higher level?
Well, we're trying to conduct basically psycholinguistic experiments in which people are hearing speech, authentic speech, and are dividing that as they see fit. And they come up with multiple level units, which are something like it's a combination of a clausal boundary, a prosodic boundary, and we're thinking a semantic boundary, but that's like something that's hard to compute. And so we're really interested in what you had to say about the segments.
Now that you've unpacked that a little bit, let me share that when people reorganize syllables into completely different word structures, they're understanding that material as having completely different prosodic structure. So for example, footnote bookworm heard as footnote bookworm versus footnote bookworm.
Mm-hmm.
The stresses, the main stresses are in totally different places. The prosodic boundaries are in different places. You know, because we had big pitch movements here, right? Footnote bookworm, right? So it suggests that that prosody is a really powerful means of organizing not only word structure, but prosodic structure at all levels.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Antonis, you have your hands up. Would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. And I have a lot of things. I don't really know where to start from, but let's take the most general and the old one. I mean to say speech units. Which are they and how they are organized? I'm afraid that many approaches have been correct during the years. I've seen things and we have discarded them. And maybe we should think again. I mean to say, before, I was thinking that speech production, which are both two sides of the same coin, that we produced or we thought we organized bigger units and we were producing them towards the end, like a question or a command. So we can't produce no linearity. How can we do? If we do things one after the other, we are blocked. And the same for perception. So we have to wait, to have to use our short memory. But the late years, I'm getting older and older, I'm thinking like it all depends how brain functions. I'm leaning towards that we have a parallel production or the brain, how the brain commands and parallel perception. And I'm thinking like this. At the same time, we can talk and walk, right? And even listen and see things. We don't do only one thing. So our models have been either linear or hierarchical or something between. It doesn't have to be like this. If the brain functions, okay, for the F0 variability, I have this brain function. For the consonants and vowels and articulation, we have that. And speech is processed like this. Likewise, perception. Those are my thoughts, but I don't know how to run an experiment on this.
I think that one of the observations that comes out of your comment is that there are shared neural systems for aspects of behavior that are cross-linguistic and non-linguistic domains, and that further levels of description are needed that, on the one hand, can allow us to talk about a strictly ordered linear sequence, but also avail a richer hierarchical representation. Certainly the notion of the brain as involving these sort of embedded layers of concepts and then words and situations, and then further on down to levels of detail. We need hierarchical representations, and that was already clear from aspects of language. So, kind of a final thought is our brains are somehow set up to absorb statistics and to develop representations of language across the various levels of representation. We have emergent representations of something like phoneme categories. We have emergent representations of prosodic structure. These are linked up according to the phonology of the language. And we also have these social communicative conventions that we learn about the right way to talk to someone or broach a pragmatic goal. So those are representations that are developed in our heads based on our statistics in concert with our intrinsic proclivities and organizational structure of our brains. And I think that you have hit on some of the most challenging and exciting areas for future research.
Thank you. Annie, do we have more questions? Because I would like a little bit more.
No more at the moment. Oh, yes, we do actually.
Me.
Hello.
Sorry, I was. Okay, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if it would be much simpler to get rid of the concept of word altogether, because it looks like what you do, it seems that you admit that children learn to read before they learn to speak. Really? And it's all the whole story about the existence of the phoneme. I think it applies to the word itself. I don't think, and you don't either, I think that we speak word by word. We speak by group of words, accent phrase. So in that case, all your experiments will be easily explained.
I think that I understand and resonate with your position. The word is a very crude concept. It implies some notion of isolation, and words don't typically occur in isolation. They certainly have some syntactic affordances and phonological properties that require create conditions that are that enable a word to be fit into a larger structure. So separating words from their context is sort of a fraught problem or oversimplification. Plus, there are agglutinative languages, right, where the morphosyntax just doesn't really readily lend itself to the idea of isolated lexical items so much. So we have to deal with all those concepts.
Because of the ideology of the word, written bias or what?
I think that maybe what we're starting to see is more awareness of the notion that the concept of a word is a limited and maybe partially correct one.
When we work, I worked with Amazon tribe who don't have any writing, and I get a very different idea.
Yeah, right. I mean, that goes to word segmentation too. It's an illusion that there are these words that are separated. That's something that our brain does. When writing things, put spaces between them on a paper, but those spaces are not physically there.
Yeah, especially what they consider a unit. That's what I mean. Just not something we would written or a linguist will describe their language and segmenting words in our sense, in the English or Portuguese in that case sense.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you anyway.
Okay, we've got another hand up from IY. Off you go.
Yep.
Oh, hello.
How are you? So
Your
nice
colleague.
talk.
Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions. So the first question is a clarification question. So you talk about the relationship between prosody and segments being overlaid on top of one another. Do you take that view as being superpositional? So that means these two levels independent of one another, and it so happens that, like, you know, the prosody can affect segmental interpretation, or you see prosody and segments being tightly linked and almost being intrinsic to one another.
Yeah, I thought your question was going to be related to sort of a superpositional, you know, sort of,
yes,
it's quasi superpositional into itself.
I just wonder if that is what you refer to or not.
Well, you know, there's sort of two levels, two things I'll unpack about your question. So I was right then, partly, there has been a debate, as you know, about the representation of prosody and prosodic structure, you know, whether it can be described as sort of a linear sequence of prosodic elements or more of a global imposition. I think that you know, there are arguments for both, and there are some non-local dependencies that speak to the need for some superpositional representation, you know, aspects of representation. But that was not the main question that you were asking. You were, I think, getting to the theoretical point I was making about the relationship between prosody and segments. And yeah, my view is that when we speak, we are drawing on principles of language composition specific to our language, our dialect, that involve co-producing, co-creating the prosodic structure and the segmental structure, such that each moment of speech that you produce, whatever its spectral segmental content and expressive content, constrains the subsequent productions moment to moment, so that these are codependent, if you will, dependent representations that are informative for listeners and highly constrained probabilistically for speakers.
Okay, then that leads me to my second question. So in one of your experiments, you showed us, you know, the manipulation of rates and then the effect of rates on percept of, I think it must be the unstressed syllable or unstressed elements, segments, or something like that. but then the magnitude of the effect is different when you manipulated the slow rates and then the fast rates. So if you predict the inter or codependence of prosody and segments, you would not expect asymmetrical relationship, but your data
you would not
showed
expect I'm sorry, just to be clear about your, you would not expect a symmetrical or asymmetrical?
Asymmetrical.
Yeah, okay.
But then your data showed asymmetry. So would you expect that, or you expect some other factors might contribute to the asymmetry?
I think you probably can guess where I'm going to land with that one. It's other factors, you know, and I can explain a little bit about a couple of things. So first of all, yeah, thank you for the question. Really good questions. Well, first of all, one of the things we've discovered with the rate manipulations is that there's like a dose-response relationship. Robert Ramez used that term, meaning however much you slow the speech or speed the speech, it will probabilistically, I mean, within limits, but it will change the probability that people hear speech in a consistent monotonic manner. So the slower the context rate, the less likely people are able to hear the word. The more you speed it, the more likely they're able to hear it if it wasn't spoken. That said, you did identify what we saw as an asymmetry. It's a little harder to get people to hear a word that wasn't spoken in the experimental paradigm than to fail to hear a word that was spoken. And that probably has to do, I think, at least in part with some of the, maybe some of the timing constraints. Like it's hard, if people are already speaking fast, then speeding up the context may make it too fast to realistically think that there is a word there. So there may be some like absolute constraints on production timing that make it less likely that you'll hear a word, maybe some local phonetic cues that you know, are resistant to alternative interpretations. That's my answer. I'm going to stick to it.
Okay, and then that will also sorry. I mean, like one question is like, you know, leading to the other question. So essentially, you know, when you think about, you know, the listener's percept of all these ghost segments, I call it ghost, meaning, you know, like sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Now, these ghost segments, these segments are not really emerging categories, but it is just emerging behavior from the listener, from the listening task. So how does that relate to your conceptualization to use dynamical system to account for, you know, these observations?
Yeah, the dynamical system, make sure I got all the question there. The dynamical systems framework is a, you know, it's an approach to thinking about how brain dynamics can give rise to emergent categories. If we go to understanding the brain as prediction engine, which is consistent with the dynamical systems view, we can see a lot of arguments across fields that the brain is using past memories of experiences to, in a generative capacity, to queue up or sequence up possible sequential representations of some stimuli and sources that are coming in, picking the best one. And my argument was that this is accomplished in linguistic social communicative contexts by having interdependent models. This is also, I'd say, I point to the work of Chigusa Kurumada, you know, some of Florian Jaeger and Ferreira's work, you know, Pickering and Garrett. You generate models of what is being said, who's saying it, and why they might be saying it in that way, in that situation, what the situation is. So those are argued to be dependent. If you have something that shifts the likelihood that you think you're talking to a woman or a man or a Black person or a white person, that has potential implications for the weighting of the other models in a nonlinear fashion. So there's a lot to be worked out. I leave it to the mathematical modelers to some extent, but conceptually, I think it's a way forward to explain some of the illusory perceptions of words and phonemes and content by drawing on that hierarchical layering of models from the conceptual level all the way down to detailed phonetic characteristics.
Then what is the stance of these illusory units being larger than a single segment or a single phoneme, for example? And then, these units, whatever the size is going to be, might be conventionalized as, some routines, which might be easily accessible. So what is the stance? What is your stance on this in relation to the dynamical system? Is it the case that the dynamical system will actually predict, the emergence in some situations when the situations are appropriate for these chunks to appear, to emerge? Would you speculate that?
Well, a preliminary response to your question is that, as far as I can tell, one of the big problems that remains to be addressed by the field is the timescales over which these predictions are made. What constrains the timescales, certainly as a person who perceives information in the world, you're bringing to bear a lifetime of experiences and trying to understand some stimulus coming in. You might have remote memories that are being brought to bear on understanding someone's words or actions, right? So the timescales are variable, and then you come to the question of, well, what are the properties of our brain's dynamical systems and neurons that allow us to pick up on patterns that can be conventionalized, in my understanding of your question anyway, in a phonological way. It's one question that I heard, right? So you can have patterns, you can have different unit sizes or different aspects of phonology that are relevant for different languages, and we have to strive as a community of scientists to understand how any particular language is possible with whatever phonological structures are observed.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about these, because that actually questions whether it is a good idea or whether it's appropriate to think in terms of fixed unit size and then how they relate to one another. So maybe the system itself is more flexible than having preconceived ideas of units and the types of units being available. So I also do not know.
I like that. I like that and would agree with you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's good to see you.
It's really nice to see you. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Antonis, would you like to ask a final question or finish off?
Well, thank you. A small comment and one common question. Well, the common is, I wouldn't agree more than you about the prediction. I was using another expression here in our discussion some time ago, and I said guessing. Most of the time, not most of the time, equal of the time, we take reliable acoustic cues and we base on them. And then, especially the Americans, a lot of reductions. So ghost phonemes are over.
On behalf of Americans, I apologize.
Listen to an American radio. Okay, which means that language, in a sense, is more cognitive psychological than physical, or a combination. So it's not physical. We can't say although we are speech scientists, I say it's not physical.
Thank you for that.
And I like your prediction approach, which is based on our experience, on our knowledge, on our whatever, on the context. So we predict, or yes, I don't know what is the difference of those two words, but anyhow, they are here, they are similar. Okay, that's a good, your approach is good. And I'm a little bit unhappy about the transcriptions. I'm against transcription, especially narrow phonetics. What is that?
Right.
What is that? There is no narrow phonetics.
I agree with you, indeed. Yeah, for sure. We in imposing international phonetic alphabet, especially narrow phonetic transcription on a signal, we're trying to put a square peg into a round hole. We're imposing something that is categorical and something that's inherently probabilistic, right? And subject to ambiguity and alternative interpretations, which come partly from the context. If you hear a different context, you might hear a different interpretation. So I appreciate your comment about the role of prediction and how important it is. And a word I didn't use enough today that I sometimes use more is inference, right? So when we perceive speech, we're not so much recovering bits, not recovering the distinctive features, but we're inferring what representation the speaker may have had in
reality, when we listen, we reconstruct speech in our brain. That is what we do, right?
Exactly.
Okay, let's write down those things. Okay, because I'm being puzzled, and we are at least two agreeing on this. And then the other aspect you said, side by side production and perception, right?
Correct.
Maybe we are too quick to reject Van Halle-Jacobson's preliminaries. They were trying at the time to find production acoustic perceptual correlates with some one-to-one correspondence. Okay, we do something in our mouth, we will have the effect on acoustics, and the acoustics will define the perception. The story was multi-dimensional, and one correlate to several and so forth, and we rejected this, and we adopted the speech code concept or whatever. But still, maybe we have been looking at the wrong places. Maybe the correlates more environment, they are on the brain. Maybe the speaker's brain has basic parallels when producing speech with the listener's brain. So
yeah,
I mean to say, we won't just reject everything as soon as we find some faulty aspect.
Inference rests in part on the speaker and the listener having common ground.
Precisely. The question then is, where are those same grounds and where are we looking?
That's a tough question. But we have to have common ground in our language knowledge. We have to be able to share some vocabulary, assumptions about how the message will unfold, and hopefully some common assumptions about the real world too, which is these days increasingly polarized and disconnected. So I really appreciate the chance today to come to this wonderful forum and share some thoughts about my research and how we can move closer to an understanding of reality and truth in language. So thank you so much, Antonis, and everyone who has come today. I really appreciate your time, attention, and the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. Then, if there is no more question, we are closing today's session. And thank you very much, Laura. And
thank you so
we will
much.
keep
My
in
pleasure.
contact and continue our discussion. Okay.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
all.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
weekend,
And
everyone.
upload, please, and upload. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.